Ça nous amène à présenter le premier conférencier émérite, le Dr. Peter Lightfoot, chef géologue pour Nickel Vales Brownfield Exploration. Nous avons l'honneur aujourd'hui de recevoir comme conférencier émérite le Dr. Peter Lightfoot, qui est géologue en chef de Vales Brownfield Exploration. À ce titre, le Dr. Lightfoot a la responsabilité de gérer les aspects techniques de différents programmes d'exploration. Le Dr. Lightfoot est détenteur d'un baccalauréat de l'Université d'Oxford et a obtenu une maîtrise de l'Université de Toronto. Il est également titulaire d'un doctorat de l'Open University. Après ses études postdoctorales à l'Université de Toronto, il s'est joint à l'Ontario Geological Survey et a travaillé sur les projets Norilsk et Sudbury. En 1996, il s'est joint à INCO et a travaillé sur de nombreux projets dans la région de la Baie-Voisie et sur la scène internationale. Après l'acquisition d'INCO par Vail, il est devenu responsable de la génération de projets d'exploration de nickel. En 2008, il est retourné travailler sur des projets d'exploration minière dans l'Atlantique Nord. Il a également reçu le prix William Garvey Gross en 1998 et est éditeur associé à la revue Economic Geology. Aujourd'hui, sa conférence a pour titre Magma Chamber Geometry and the Localization of Nickel, Copper and PG Sulfide Mineralization, Global Examples and their Relevance to Voisey's Bay. Et elle sera présentée en anglais. Dr. Lightfoot.
Thank you very much, Paul, and thank you to EMIC for the invitation to give this presentation today. It's a real pleasure to be back in Quebec City. My presentation today is designed to try and give you a bit of a new flavor of the understanding of nickel, copper, and PGE sulfide ore deposits. The traditional views are very much rooted in some concepts, some key parameters which use in exploration when looking for nickel. Obviously, they rotate around the importance of mafic and ultramafic magmas, around country rocks that are rich in crustal sulfur. They've also, ideas have been used about exploring within certain tectonomagmatic settings. But in all of this, remarkably little effort has been put into understanding the structural configuration that controls the distribution of nickel deposits. And my talk today is very much rooted around this, and it was originated almost 15 years ago when I started my work on Voisey's Bay and carried through many of the exploration projects at Voisey's. And the ideas of structural geology were rooted there. So I'm going to start this presentation in that light. I'm going to summarize my basic takeaway messages so you have a clear understanding from the start about what my thesis is to you today. The first point is the distribution of mineralization at Voisey's Bay is controlled by a conduit system within space created during magma emplacement in a fault zone system. And this is where basically the role of structure comes into play. What I'm going to try and do in this talk is show you this is not just a feature of Voisey's Bay, but it is almost the key criterion that comes into play when you're looking at other nickel deposits around the world. It's almost the most fundamentally critical feature that is recognized. I'm going to show you the structural controls on the emplacement of small intrusions, and I'm going to show you that many of those intrusions have sulfides that have been transported into their final location. They didn't form by segregation in situ. They were moved into those magma chambers. I'm going to show you examples of intrusions that have a very specific form. They look like wine glasses, subvertical, open system magma conduits that are historically termed conoliths. I'll take you to many examples around the world, including a large number from China. And I'm also going to talk to the accumulation of mineralization in sub-horizontal versions of these conoliths. Norilsk Talnak is a very key example. The end of this, what I'd like you to go away with is a model for the formation of nickel deposits in the roots of large igneous provinces along major mantle-penetrating structural zones. probably linked to major breakup of supercontinents. So we'll start the story in Voisey's Bay. The deposit is located in an area of Labrador along a very pronounced series of west-east structures, some of which have probably been reactivated by the opening of the Labrador Sea. Voisey's Bay actually sits at the meeting point between a north-south feature, which is the Archean Proterozoic boundary, and these basically east-west features. This shows up very nicely in the geology as well, with major controls on the geology in an east-west setting, and also the development of mainly tabular-shaped intrusions of granitoids, anorthosites, and mafic intrusive complexes. Voisey's Bay is one of several. It includes the giant Kigler-Pate and Hetash, the Newark Island, and north of Voisey's Bay is the Mushwa complex. If we look at a simple plan of the Voisey's Bay deposit, what we basically see is a large intrusion that comes to surface, which is referred to as the Eastern Deeps intrusion, which is sheeted out by a series of younger granites. And this is connected at depth to a dike, which extends to the north of the chamber before keeling over to depth towards the north. West of it, the intrusion connects through the ovoid deposit into a dike-like body, which is called the Reed Brook Dike. And below the Reed Brook Dike, there is another large chamber like the Eastern Deeps sitting at depth underneath this chamber. The distribution of mineralization along the trend is controlled not just by the dike itself, but also by the entry point of the dike into this chamber. If you view this in terms of the long section, XY, here's the ovoid at surface, currently being mined. The Eastern Deeps intrusion sitting at the base of the Eastern Deeps between around 400 meters and about 800 meters depth. And then a series of raking domains within the dike, which include the Discovery Hill zone and the Reed Brook zone, which now extends quite a ways down. It's almost a continuous domain of mineralization extending, plunging roughly 45 degrees down the dike towards the east. And then the Western Deeps chamber at depth underneath this. If we look in particular at the geometry around the ovoid deposit, that's in this area here, you can see here three sections that show the geological relationships in the ovoid. The first section at the west of the ovoid shows a slug of massive sulfide, the perfect pit shape, sitting beneath it a little bit of breccia and ferrogabbro, and then connecting to a dike which keels over with depth and bends underneath the system. But interestingly, underneath the ovoid is another dike which is almost continuous, which is part of the same system. As you go further to the east, the ovoid becomes smaller, the amount of disseminated sulfide decreases, and this dike actually joins into the system from beneath the ovoid to the south of the ovoid in the area we refer to as the southeast extension deposit, which is basically a disseminated sulfide. And then as you go further to the east, section C, you can basically see just the tail end of the ovoid. That's this ore body here, which is now actually sitting within a dike. And that dike is actually coming out in the area of the southeast extension. And beneath this, there are actually at least two other feeder dikes feeding into the southeast extension. So what you basically see is a stacked series of magma conduits that come into the ovoid. If you go over to the Eastern Deeps, the relationships are not quite as complex as they're presently understood. What you basically have is the Eastern Deeps chamber. You have this dike, which originates at some point to the north of the system, keels over. Within the dike are a series of mineralized zones, but the main slug of massive sulfides is right at the entry point of this dike, right beneath a subvertical wall of gneiss. And surrounding this there is a domain of weakly mineralized variable textured troctolite. Within this wall, there are another series of flat-looking structures, some of which contain material that is very similar to the material in the conduits. And it's quite possibly in the historic rush to actually drill holes and assay sulfides that some of these features high in the wall of the eastern deeps were not actually recognized as conduits feeding into the system. So if you look at this in the context of the overall system at Voisey's Bay, what we presently see are a series of major east-west structures that appear to define the walls and discontinuities of the system. The conduit itself appears, as far as we know at this point in time, not to follow a curved structure, but each of the walls of the body have clearly seen some movements in the area of Discovery Hill. Many of the ore deposits are sitting along sub-horizontal structures. There's a small mineral discovery at Red Dog to the south of Voisey's Bay, the Eastern Deeps Chamber, north of the Eastern Deeps, and the Ovoid, all tied into one system. And then going progressively towards the west, the mineralization is hosted either within this dike-like body or within flat structures that, again, come off the sides of the dike, and in many cases the mineralization extends away. And I'll be telling you a bit more about these zones later on this morning when I talk specifically to Voisey's Bay. So there's the context of Voisey's Bay, and what these messages sent quite strongly was that there was something going on that was quite fundamental in terms of controlling the location of magma chambers, and that structures were very important in the definition of the geometry. So I'm going to start off and show you some other examples that they're not exactly like Voisey's Bay. They share many common features. The examples I'm going to start with are in China. The major deposits in China are Jinshuan, which sits on the southern edge of the North China Craton, the Hongxiling deposits in Jilin province, which just sit on the north edge of the Korea-China Craton. There's a belt of deposits in Xinjiang deposit in the west, including Huangshandong, Huangshan, Tulargan, Hulu, all sitting within a single belt here. Another belt contains the Karatunk deposit in the north. In the western Tian Shan, a series of deposits at the northern edge of the Taimyr Craton include a deposit called Jimbalaka. And if you go down to the area of the Yangtze, major deposits at the edge of the Yangtze block, including ones like Limahe. There's also quite close by the Yangluping deposits and a series of smaller deposits on the edge of the Yangtze block, including Jingguanshan. So let's start in Gansu province in Jinshuan. Jinshuan is a very, very small intrusion. It's only around 5 kilometers in length. It's this tiny body here. It's sitting within a large Proterozoic block that comprises the long Shushan Mantin Belt. A series of faults follow it, some of which are quite major strike-slip faults. It's one of a number of other intrusions, including the Qingxi Jing intrusion in Zhangbutai in the western part of the belt, but none of these contain significant amounts of mineralization. So effectively, Jinshuan is a standalone case. If you look at the geology of Jinshuan, the entire outcrop area of the intrusion is about 1.5 square kilometers. It's a tiny target. It's not something you would immediately fall over as an obvious target if it didn't have mineralization at the surface. The initial discovery was made in mine area number 1 by a geologist from the Gansu Geological Bureau. His name is Tang Zhongli, and he's famous for his work on Jinshuan. The intrusion breaks out into 4 blocks, and in each of these sections you can see it's basically got a dike-like configuration. Very often the sides, in fact just about everywhere, the sides of the intrusion are structures. Mineralization typically is controlled towards the base on the east side of the intrusion. Sometimes it's a little more centralized, but in this case here in the thicker part of the intrusion, it's more on the eastern side. You can actually cross this entire intrusion, all 700 meters across it, and not find a speck of sulfide here, yet there's probably 200 million tons of mineralization sat at depth underneath this body at a depth of around about 500 meters. Altogether, about 500 million tons of 1.1% nickel in what is effectively a non-compliant resource. Here's the intrusion at surface, and I defy you to find the sulfide as you walk across it. It's just not obvious. It's not obvious by any step of it or any obvious. It's not obvious by any step of it or any of the standards of nickel mineralization. It's not full of all sorts of inclusions and chaotic rocks. It's a very simple donetic intrusion. Ideas for the emplacement of the Jinshuan intrusion originated with Tang Zhongli. His pioneering exploration here resulted in a number of scientific papers, and he basically proposed that the intrusion was filled from a magma chamber at depth by a magma that was sulfide saturated, and that the sulfides were actually emplaced along with the magma into the intrusion in a series of steps. And he recognized probably five different steps in the formation of the intrusion. It's exactly the same sort of stepped approach to the emplacement of sulfides that you see at Voisey's Bay, and his model was a perfect model actually for the formation of the Voisey's Bay system. Let's go now to Jilin province in the eastern part of China. It's a small block up here on the north side of the Korean Craton. The deposit comprises two principal ore bodies, the number 1 and number 7 ore bodies, now effectively almost mined out, and they're all constrained by a structure which runs northwest to southeast within a group of Proterozoic sediments referred to as the Hulan group. These intrusions are probably early Permian in age, although there's some debate about the exact age, but they're very, very small. If you take the number 1 intrusion, that's the northern one, you can see the size of this intrusion is only around 600 meters by about 250 meters in size. Yet this probably produced about 6 million tons of probably about 0.7 to 1% nickel from a body comprising a series of differentiated peroxenites, gabbros, and peridotites. You can see it bounded again by a structure, and that structure actually doesn't have an obvious keel to the east of the dike, but the west of the dike, the western side of the structure is a weakly mineralized gabbro peridotite, which extends to around about 600 meters depth. So you go to the number 7 intrusion in the south. Once again, what you see is a dike. The dike is only about 30 meters in width. It extends down around about 500 meters and is mineralized almost its entire way. At surface, it outcrops as a 700-meter long intrusion within a graben-like structure. The graben walls actually very nicely now follow the side, and you can see these in the young tertiary sediments where the walls of the intrusion were reactivated after the main graben started to fill in with sediments. So again, a series of structures which are essentially following the line of the intrusion. Jilin is a beautiful ore. It's around about 14.5% nickel. Nice pentlandites sitting in pyrrhotite. It's the classic Cambalda-looking style of mineralization, except it's sitting in a gabbro-peridotite host. As you come into the southern part of China, there are a whole series of mineral deposits associated with small intrusions sitting in a fault zone that historically has been called the Pangxi Fault Zone. It's a series of north-south faults that are probably splays off the Red River Eilishon strike slip fault system. The whole area is covered by a series of flood basalts, so it's very much a Norilsk type setting. These are Hermitian flood basalts. They're about 65 million years old, which they're about the same age as the Siberian trap flood basalts, and these intrusions are sitting in association with subvolcanic intrusions, which tend to follow the north-south trend of the fabric of the area. If we take one example of it, the Limaher deposit, and you're starting to see now a little bit of a theme coming through in these different sections, but this is an east-west section through the intrusion. The intrusion is actually sitting in a strike slip fault system comprising a series of gabbros and diorites and a little bit of peridotite. In the section, you're basically again seeing the development of this champagne glass-shaped intrusion with much of the mineralization choking the base. In some ways, that could almost be a section through parts of the western part of the mini ovoid at Voisey's Bay. This tiny intrusion probably had about 12.5 million tons of mineralization. Again, it's a historic resource. There are virtually no compliant numbers for ore bodies in China, so you basically have to take them as they come. Here's another example from Sichuan. This is, again, in association with the Ermitian flood basalt event. Basically, what you're seeing is a mined-out area, but that mined-out area looks like a champagne glass. It has a tail-like dike with massive sulfides, and this whole intrusion is actually faulted off, but it sits within a north-south trending fault zone system. So again, a dead ringer here for the mini ovoid at Voisey's Bay. If you go to Western China, a series of deposits here along the Hami-Huangshan belt in the eastern part of Xinjiang actually tie into a major fault here, which is the Kanga fault system. In the western part of the area, there is another major series of faults, and another mafic intrusion sits in those faults and contains a significant disseminated sulfide at Chimbalaka. And then up in the northern part of Xinjiang, Karatunka actually again sits within a northwest-southeast regional fault system, another example of these small intrusions. So starting with Huangshan Dong in the eastern part, it's sitting within this domain referred to as the Kanga shear zone. It's a structural zone, and the sides of the intrusion are basically structures. In plan view, it looks like a diamond-shaped intrusion. A series of differentiated rocks from peridotites all the way through diorites. Draw a section north to south. It's been drilled off by the Chinese historically. Chairman Mao did a marvelous job of exploration during his 5-year plans. I mean, his holes went down to about 900 meters, right the way to the base. And the internal geometry of this intrusion is quite well known. Contains a significant body of disseminated sulfide, which is presently being mined by ad hoc operations near surface. Go to Chimbalaka. This is in the Natchan fault zone. Again, it's a series of shears. It's sense of displacement shown here. And you basically see a diamond-shaped intrusion, and with the association of disseminated sulfides with olivine gabbro and hornblende gabbro, it actually has an ultramafic core. Again, we don't know for sure that this intrusion actually has structures going down the side of it. It hasn't actually been mapped in tremendous detail, nor do we know much about the basal geometry of this. But there's a good betting that as you go down, you go into a feeder domain that is more like Huangshan Dong in geometry. Here's Karatunka in the northern part of Xinjiang, and this is just a long section through the intrusion that shows a body that extends from surface. It actually only has an outcrop area of about 500 square meters, and most of the intrusion plunges to depth and is entirely hidden by carboniferous cover. The massive sulfides tend to be in the core of this, and if you draw a series of sections through this body, what you basically see is almost looks like a snake, where you've cut the body of the snake into a series of slices, and you're actually seeing the contents of the sulfide sitting at the base of the snake's belly. Very much a pipe-like body, a conolith, as I like to call it. Conoliths don't just exist in one place. There's another absolutely beautiful example, and I've just jumped continents to confuse you, but this is from Western Australia in the Musgraves. It's a BHP Billiton discovery called Babel Nebo. This body, it was mapped out at surface after an overburden discovery. Comprises a couple of bodies with disseminated sulfide mineralization, referred to as Babel and Nebo, separated by a younger fault. But basically, if you draw a section through this beast, it looks just like Karatunka. It has that geometry of a magma tube. So we have to go now to Norilsk because we see exactly the same sorts of geometry in the Norilsk systems. This is the location of Norilsk. It's at the edge of the 250-60 million year old Siberian trap flood basalts near to the Arctic. To the west is the West Siberian lowlands that comprise a series of basalts within rifts. And Norilsk sits right at the edge of the Siberian Shield. The geology of the Norilsk region, a series of major faults, the Norilsk-Karolak fault, the Imangda fault, and then a whole series of joining faults, bridging faults between these major faults. The ore bodies in association with the Norilsk-1 intrusion, the Karolak intrusion, and the Talnak intrusion actually sit, as we've shown in the past, underneath a series of basalts which form an edifice right on top of this area. These basalts are referred to as the Nadezhda Formation, and these basalts are tremendously depleted in nickel, copper, cobalt, and precious metals. And so there's been a lot of argument in the literature that the basalts are actually the footprint showing you basically that the mineral potential exists underneath these basaltic rocks in this particular area. And clearly we know it's there, so it's hard to imagine that the thickest isopachs of metal-depleted basalt wouldn't be anywhere else but right over some of the world's largest nickel deposits. The Talnak Norilsk area is an amazing area. In this one photograph, I'm not going to do it right now, but I did count 15 head frames on the Karolak intrusion. It is truly a giant resource, probably with well over 1.5 billion tons of massive and disseminated sulfide mineralization here. The stratigraphy of the area is quite complex. It comprises a series of Devonian to Carboniferous rocks, but there are two key formations within the stratigraphy, what I call the Raz formation, because I can't pronounce the rest, and the Tunguska series stratigraphy contain the principal mineralized ore bodies, namely the Karolak ore body and the Talnak and Norilsk ore body. And the really important thing about these stratigraphies is that they are argillites and siltstones. They're not evaporites. Everyone seems to have this impression that all the evaporites are eaten up and transported away by Norilsk. It's actually a series of shaly rocks, which were probably quite sulfidic, actually. So the main mineralized intrusions occur in two stratigraphic positions, one within the lower Devonian and the other within the middle Carboniferous. If we look at the stratigraphy here of the intrusion in the context of the regional setting, here's the major fault, the Norilsk-Karolak fault. This is the Talnak intrusion to the east and the western part of the Talnak intrusion, and then the main Karolak intrusion. You can see the massive nickel-rich ores sitting at the base of the intrusion in both cases, and the intrusions are broadly conformable with the stratigraphy, with the Karolak intrusion sitting lower down in the stratigraphy than the Talnak intrusion. The intrusions also have a lot of apophyses. Some of these turn into sill-like bodies. Some of them turn into little arms that head off the edges of the system. And this is what actually generates a large metamorphic halo around the system. It isn't the quantity of magma flowing through this intrusion. It's actually these little intrusions that are cross-cutting into the surrounding country rocks and producing Proxene-Hornfels metamorphism. The intrusions have a very interesting geometry. This is actually the geometry of the intrusion underneath that mineralized intrusion, the low Talnak. The low Talnak forms a very, very continuous sheet throughout the entire Norilsk region. But the really interesting thing about this sheet is that it has thick domains, almost like they're lava magma conduits that pass through the sheet-like body. So here's one example here where the thickness of the intrusion is greater than 120 meters. And there's another very thick domain that follows the main axis of the fault. Well, the way I imagine these as being magma tubes is that it formed a sheet, and then there was a dilation in the sheet which filled with magma to make your magma conduit. So although you have quite a large flat intrusion, there are key domains within it which actually most of the magma actually traveled through. This intrusion here isn't mineralized, but the Karolak intrusion is a good example of one that is. And here you can see isopachs of thickness of the Karolak intrusion. You can see two principal arms. One of the arms follows the orientation of the Norilsk-Karolak fault, And I think that's probably because that channelway was actually created by a collapse of the sedimentary sequence as activation took place along the Norilsk-Karolak fault. And then there's another series which heads off towards the northwest, which passes through all of the main Komsomolsk, Taimirsk, and Oktyabrsk ore deposits. And again, here the thickness of the intrusion is quite considerable. Now, when you look at the distribution of mineralization in the context of the thickness of the intrusion, what you see is that the thickest zones of massive sulfide are right along the axes of the thick domains of the intrusion. And so here you actually see all the Oktyabrsk ore bodies sitting along the axis of this thick channelway, and then another relatively thick channelway heading north-south along the Norilsk-Karolak fault. So again, the geometry of mineralization is controlled by tube-like bodies. Even though they spread out and form apophyses, it's the main tube that actually controls the mineralization. When you look at these bodies in section, this is from the north part of the Karolak and Talnak intrusion. These are starting to look very much like the Karatunk and Babel-Nebo cases, where they're basically almost blind intrusions which contain massive nickel-rich ore bodies at the base, and typically in association with the edges of the main Karolak fault. So these faults have obviously played some role in development of these magma chambers. The frontal ends of these intrusions are quite complex, and they contain many apophyses in association with the wide metamorphic halo. And there are also cases where the basal contact nickel-rich ores have been injected upwards and actually fractionate into cuprous ores, which are referred to as the breccia ores. These are some pictures of the host rocks of the area. These are the pyroxene hornfells, and these are the metasedimentary rocks which are invaded by these little toes of diabasic composition, which actually are the frontal edges of the intrusion as it forces its way into the sedimentary package. The cuprous ores, they sit at the top of the Karolak intrusion and the base of the Talnak intrusion. And what do these look like in section? You basically see a breccia zone sitting at the top of the intrusion. This only has about 0.7% nickel, but ores here typically have 3 or 4% copper and about 10 to 15 grams of precious metals. A very thick and a very economically important domain of the complex for Norilsk Nickel's future production here. And this is some examples of the breccia associations. Very much complex, metasomatized, broken up sedimentary succession, sometimes some igneous rocks incorporated, highly corroded, and then a lot of different rock types involved here, everything from evaporite right the way through to shaly compositions with disseminated and net textured sulfides. Other examples of conoliths, just like the Talnak, are the Norilsk 1. This is a section through the Norilsk 1 intrusion. It basically shows two closed system conduits here, one of which is mined out in the Bearsbrook pit. And the disseminated sulfides, very, very typical of this area, sometimes almost looking like they had an original vesicular appearance. And perhaps some of these intrusions were emplaced very close to the surface. That may explain some of these features. The other key point in the sulfide ores at Norilsk is the development of massive sulfide along what are clearly structures. So these intrusions have been modified post-crystallization as well, with the redistribution of nickel-rich mineralization along structures within the gabbro dolerites at the base of the intrusion. So I'm going to slip away from Norilsk now and come across to Canada and to the United States. The Mid-Continent Rift, a Proterozoic gauged feature full of a series of basaltic rocks, but with a number of important nickel-copper PG sulfide occurrences and deposits. Key examples historically have been the low-grade deposits of the Duluth complex along the north side, and more recently discovery of important bodies of mineralization within the Eagle intrusion in Michigan, the Tamarack intrusion in Minnesota, and most recently the Current Lake complex in Ontario. These significant semi-massive to massive and disseminated sulfides are usually in association with major tectonic zones. Tamarack sits almost within the Great Lakes tectonic zone. I think Eagle probably sits in broadly within a splay of that, and Current Lake is in association with the Quetico system. Here's the Current Lake complex. What you basically see here is a series of mafic intrusions, and you look at the geometry of those intrusions, and they almost look like they're defining a series of intersecting faults. And on bridging structures between these appear these bodies that look very much like these conoliths that I've described at Norilsk and elsewhere that contain the disseminated sulfide mineralization. If you go to the Eagle deposit in Michigan, it's a little different. It's more like those champagne glass deposits that I described to you in China. Basically, you have a keel, a dike-like keel, a large body of main intrusion with massive and semi-massive sulfides in association. So more of a champagne glass appearance, but again sitting within broadly a structural zone, which is defining the walls of this intrusion. So now you've got a picture of all these intrusions. I've probably taken you through about, I don't know, a fair number of the different nickel deposits on the planet. I haven't talked to Sudbury, but I could probably show you examples at Sudbury where structure is a critical factor. But what I'm basically telling you is that we have a series of features here that are quite important from a structural perspective. I want to step back from that a little way now and look at it more of a global context. And what I did here was I just took the database of all the nickel mineralization through time, and I just plotted up the age of all the ore deposits against the contained nickel in kilotons of metal, just to see, first of all, whether or not there were any associations. And what you basically can quite nicely see here is that you have your key Archean Komatiite associations forming this peak around about 2.8. You have a series of Proterozoic, early Proterozoic ore deposits forming this peak at around about 1.8. Includes things like Thompson, Raglan, Pachenga, many other examples as well. Then there's a scattering of other significant deposits in between, which includes probably Jinshuan is one of these, probably this one here. And then all these deposits here are the Chinese deposits and the deposits in Siberia, which form again another fundamental apogee of nickel mineralization. If you actually look at this in the context of the major contributions of new juvenile crust, in other words, this is a measure of the impact of amalgamation of continents and breakup of continents. You basically see that the key periods of new generation of crust actually coincide with these points of nickel mineralization. Not quite as strong in Pangaea, but still there is clearly a linkage. And it appears that Kenora land was a major continent breakup. Columbia event, the Rodinia event, and the Pangaea event were all events associated with the breakup of supercontinents. And lo and behold, all of the nickel sulfide mineralization you see is focusing right at the point of in time when those continents were starting to break apart. The breaking mechanism has variously been attributed to these nice big red splodges of magma that we call mantle plumes, heat sources in the deep mantle, generating large volumes of mafic volcanism. These aren't very good, though, normally at forming little standalone small nickel deposits. But the probable reason for that is that we look for those typical things in the middle of the rift, whereas we should actually be looking at the edge, where these large plumes are actually spreading out and forming much more discrete pulses of magma. And again, I think these are following major mantle-penetrating faults, and the intrusions are actually forming within these magma passageways defined by these structures. This idea developed a little further with Graham Begg's work in economic geology, where he basically looked at the diversity of low magnesium and high magnesium styles of mineralization. And again, he proposed that the edges of these lithospheric keels in association with domains of breaking crust were key areas where the processes took place that actually generated mineral systems, and typically more of a marginal basin for high magnesium rocks versus a much tighter junction of crustal blocks for low magnesium types. How do these bodies make their way into these structures? Well, I kind of like to come back to some of the things I see in the field when I walk around, and this is something I actually saw in Sudbury a year ago near to Creighton Mine. It's actually a splay of the Creighton Fault. You can see it's a very, very nice example of a transtensional space that's actually been filled up by this vein quartz. If you took away the structure that actually breaks this up, you'd end up with a diamond-shaped body. And I'd submit the geometry of these types of little veins very much resembles the types of intrusions that you see in association with nickel sulfide systems. How do these things develop? Well, the creation of space in a strike-slip fault system is probably very familiar to all of the experts in gold and many other deposit systems, but really has not been something that people have had in the front of their mind in terms of the evolution of nickel systems. Basically, here is an opportunity to create space for a mantle-derived magma to flow from depth to the surface and to occupy a very, very small conduit. Here's the example where the things are closing together, so there's not really very much space here for any magma to make its way through. Here's a nice example of a little pull-apart basin, and again, you're seeing the diamond shape being developed. This is a dead ringer for the shapes of many of those deposits in China, and is probably a principal control on the morphology. How do these things develop? Well, there's a very nice paper by Geraud in 1995 that shows the porosity structure of shear zones on a very, very local scale. What I'm recommending here is that this concept be scaled up to the scale of whole shear zones into which mafic magmas are actually emplaced. It's a nice example of the way in which space can actually be created. So in summary, many magmatic nickel-copper PG sulfide ore bodies are not the product of simple in situ gravity settling within magma chambers. I've showed you a whole bunch of examples where there's 10 to 1,000,000 times more sulfide in these intrusions than will come out of the magma which went into that intrusion. It clearly examples where the sulfides have been injected, and Voisey's Bay is probably the best example. Jinchuan is another excellent example. I believe Norilsk is an example where in situ sulfide formation was not as important as the introduction of sulfide from depth. For these examples shown, sulfide-laden magma ascended through subvertical conduit systems in a structural zone from parental sources and chamber at depth. So large volumes of magma at depth, which were able to donate the metals to sulfides and produce the mineralization we see. We have conduit morphology controlled by the intersection of regional structures that create space, localized by dilations and traps created by non-isotropic structural conditions. And the two outcomes I've described, which are end members of a spectrum, are the champagne glass-shaped intrusions and conoliths. I think they probably both occur in the same place in some places like Norilsk. There's a global distribution and link to large igneous events. I don't think the link to flood basalts can be dismissed. It's clearly very important. But what really is critical is this linkage to supercontinent breakup and the superplume events that produce these major breakups that produce the distribution of nickel mineralization through time. And it remains for me to say that I'm going to come back in the talk I'm going to be giving later on for Dawn, describing some of the more detailed aspects of Voisey's Bay. My thanks go out to all the crew I've worked with in various countries, not least Vivian Fang in China, and to all of the folks at Voisey's Bay who basically started me off thinking along these lines. Thank you for your time today.
On aura définitivement le temps de quelques questions. Alors, s'il y a des gens qui veulent poser des questions au Dr. Lightfoot. Alors, merci beaucoup, Dr. Lightfoot, pour cette excellente conférence.